Welcome to Food for Thought, this debate. Thanks to everyone for coming. This is the launch of the Biosphere project under our Here Here campaign today. So I'm not going to say very much. I'm just going to introduce the chair, and the chair's then going to introduce the speakers. We've got a whole fantastic set of speakers coming up, talking about the various themes that apply to the South Downs and the relationship to us in Brighton and Hove and the urban area here. Hopefully you've all had a chance to take advantage of the local lunch, which is from the farm cafe. Hopefully you've all enjoyed that. And I'm just going to introduce Martin Price, who's going to chair the event today. He is the chair of the UK Man and the Biosphere Committee, and they are the group who are overseeing our application to UNESCO for Biosphere Reserve status. Thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Martin Price.
Okay, thank you. Well, my role today is to chair and not to talk. But I'm very glad to be here in Brighton. I don't think I've ever been to Brighton before. When I was 3, I think I went to Rottingdean, and that's the closest I've ever got. And so I know what I've missed now. And I walked out on the pier today and saw how beautiful it is, and I've been wandering around in the streets. I've also discovered that food in Brighton is excellent, and that's one of the opportunities that a biosphere can bring is opportunities for business in tourism, food, arts, education, all sorts of different areas. What is a biosphere? Well, I'm sure you're going to get lots of versions of it over the next while from the team, but basically what UNESCO says a biosphere is, it should be a site of excellence to explore or demonstrate sustainable development, including conservation, which we'll hear a bit about, at the regional scale. And really that means doing things together in partnership. And we don't have the particular logo that I saw yesterday, but there are already 16 different organisations, county councils, district councils, city councils. I better stop before I make any mistakes, but also agencies, the University of Brighton, etc. So there's a very wide range of players already saying they want to be involved in this, but it's important not just to have the organisations, but the people too. And I think that's one of the main reasons for having this discussion today. It can't just be from the bottom up of the organisations, it has to be from the real bottom up of having local people directly involved. And I guess the idea of having friends of the biosphere is a very important bit. If you haven't signed up to be a friend, then I think you should be encouraged to do so. I'm not quite sure how you do it, but he can tell you. Do it outside. So, anyway, one thing to say though is we're talking here about the South Downs, but of course the South Downs are the backdrop for what's going on down here in Brighton and Hove. The water is coming down, the people are going up and enjoying the landscape, etc. So really what we're looking to discuss here are what are the shared values, what are the shared interests across all these different groups that we have representatives here speaking today. How does that relate to the existing national park, and how will that relate to what will be proposed to UNESCO in the relatively near future, and hopefully will be approved by UNESCO. So, without any further ado, I will introduce the first speaker, who is William White from the National Farmers Union Regional Director. There's more information on the back of the sheets about everyone if you want to know, but I'm just going to give the short versions. So, William, thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Excellent. This is the question, I believe, was posed. What role should the South Downs play in our lives? And what I intend to do is answer that question, set the scene, just tell you about some of the demands on farmers, things to bear in mind as the audience for the debate, and then I guess answer questions after that if I'm still here and haven't been thrown out. So what role should the South Downs play in our lives? From a farmer's perspective, I believe the answer is to produce food, fuel and fibre, and the provision of green goods, landscape, biodiversity and green energy. Just to put things in context from a South Downs point of view, 1,100 commercial farms in the South Downs, 3,200 employees, and gross value added of about 100 million pounds. And it's a tiny proportion of some of the other sectors that you'll find in this region. But if we bulk that up and look at the food chain as a whole, you can see the figures start to mount up. And strategically, food production is important. Doesn't matter where it is, whether it's on the South Downs or on the uplands, which the chairman is probably more familiar with. So then we have a more respectable contribution to GVA. I wanted to put up a quick slide about where a farm business gets its income from these days, and you'll see here actually quite a low proportion comes from selling actual agricultural commodities. Other things there you can see, but I'll come on to those in just a moment to save some time. But if we plot these out, all farm types. So this is the receipts from selling farm produce in the blue. Look at lowland grazing. I should have a pointer. But, a lot of grazing going on the downs, not particularly profitable. If you then add on agri-environment schemes, these are grant schemes, and then you put diversification, so renting out buildings and the like, and then this on top is the subsidy, the single payment, and that's what actually puts profit or margin into some of the sectors that we're talking about, even today, when prices are in fact improving. So demands on farmers are changing. All farmers these days are expected to produce more and at the same time impact less. They're being pressed to deliver more environmental goods and increasingly having to look at the market for their returns, and that's what volatility in commodity production looks like. So quite interesting times for farmers. Where's their income coming from in the future? Hopefully farm income will do this, increase. Other employment income, fine, yes, send the wife out to, or the partner out to work, that sort of thing. Diversification income, sorry, is that a politically correct remark? I withdraw that. I think environmental income will do that, and I'm talking about grants because hopefully farming income will be able to pay for good environmental works. Subsidy income, I think, will do that. You as taxpayers will probably had enough of subsidising agriculture as you see it, and I think green income will come in too. Bear in mind, South Downs, 85% of it is conventionally farmed. It's not a wilderness. It's an unusual national park. It is the most populated national park of all of them. And the majority of land is in private ownership. It's not right to roam. The South Downs never was all grass. And we have a statutory purpose. The National Park Authority must foster economic well-being. It cannot just tie us up in knots. Beautiful landscape is a byproduct of profitable farming and not the other way round. Farming policy is essentially driven by Brussels, not necessarily the National Park Authority. And change, in my belief, or the industry's belief, is done by cooperation and incentive rather than regulation. And just a hobby horse of mine, there are 3,200 kilometres of rights of way. That means a lot of dogs in the countryside, and just occasionally we have some very bad owners out there who let their dogs off, think it's lovely playing with sheep, and then you have a lot of livestock worrying as a result. Challenges for the National Park Authority. Here we've just got some pictures of solar voltaics, solar farm, wind turbines, close trellis fruit trees, also read into that vineyards, and some funny looking livestock buildings at the bottom. How do you judge success? This is the last but one slide. A farmer said to me, if I don't notice any change because of the national park, they'll have got it about right. And poor old Trevor, who's sitting down here, that's a very difficult challenge for him because he's being paid God knows what to actually make a difference in the South Downs National Park. Bless him. And I put a few of our leaflets about the South Downs, quite a good learning resource. I see there's some students in the audience, so do pick one up on the way out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, William. Does everyone have presentations, by the way? Right. Okay. Woohoo. Right. I pressed the wrong button. We need a technical expert here to get to the next one. While I introduce Lucy Roberts, who is the Solent and South Downs Technical Specialist for the Environment Agency. And here comes her presentation. Brilliant. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for having me along today. Can everyone hear all right? Yeah, it is working fab. what I'm going to do, I'm actually the groundwater technical specialist at the Environment Agency, and what I'm going to do today is give you a very brief introduction into groundwater. Why is it important in the area? Why should we care about it? And talk a little bit about what we're seeing locally in the groundwater and what we can do. Right, so what is groundwater? Basically, when rain falls, it either runs off into the rivers, into the Ader and into the Ouse, or it'll soak into the ground. It's all been very political recently, hasn't it, with the drought? But it soaks into the ground and gets stored within what we call the matrix, so sort of the sponge of this big chalk block that we're all sitting on. It comes out, it either flows out into the rivers from there, or it will actually be pulled out. You can see here it's been pulled in towards boreholes, which are used for a number of things, from from water supplies, local water supplies, big public water supplies, agriculture. All sorts of people use this water. In terms of what happens to the groundwater, what are the risks? There's a few put up on the slide here. So all sorts of things like septic tanks and leaking sewers are one thing. Agricultural chemicals, also chemicals used in parks and gardens, petrol stations, all these things have a risk. Any chemicals that go on the ground, there is a chance they will go into the ground and into a water supply. Now, in terms of where the water supplies are locally, what you can see is there's a picture of Brighton. This is Brighton all the way over to Eastbourne down here. The chalk is pretty much marked out by the top of these blue lines down here, coming down like this. And basically anything within one of these blue lines, anything that goes onto the ground there can get into a public water supply. So that's why we have to be extra careful about what's going on in the, all around us. The red dots are what we know as abstraction, so people that we give licenses to take water out of the ground or out of the river. You can see over here, people are taking out of the river here rather than out of the ground. But of course those rivers are also fed by groundwater. The blue dots are actually the private supplies, so these are the ones where people are using less water than we need to know about. But actually you can see, over the vast majority of the area, there's a lot of people using water and it feeds into these supplies. In terms of what we can do to help, as I said, think really hard about what chemicals you're using. Where do you dispose of them? Does everyone take them to the tip rather than, and dispose of them properly? Or do you ever just pour them on the ground, in the drain? Everyone can play a part in, using and disposing of chemicals in a sensible way. And of course, there's saving water. The more water we use, the more area we have to take the water out of. So let's use, save water as best as we can. Generally, groundwater is a very good, cheap, clean source of water. I mean, in the Brighton area, it's actually amazingly one of the cleaner areas that we've got. I work across sort of the whole of Hampshire, the Isle of Wight and Sussex. And this is certainly the Brighton chalk and the Seaford and Eastbourne chalk. So this block and this block, they're one of the cleaner lots of water that we see. We do see nitrates going into them, partly from, there's rising trends, partly from historic use, agricultural use, partly from existing use at the moment. We see pesticides and things in there as well. The good news story is you're seeing a downward trend in the concentrations for things like atrazine. Well, atrazine was banned a few years ago, and it's great. We're seeing the groundwater recovering. But what we are seeing is we're seeing other pesticides starting to come up. And one that, all the science says we shouldn't be seeing, but we are occasionally, is glyphosate. That's used in products such as Roundup and things like that. So yeah, there's lots of things that we're doing. Anyway, so in terms of a summary, we have good, cheap, clean groundwater. Good, cheap, clean water because we're using groundwater. let's try and do what we can to be aware of it and keep it that way.
Okay. Right, that was the last presentation, I think. Okay, so thank you very much, Lucy. Our next speaker is Tony Whitbread, Chief Executive of the Sussex Wildlife Trust. Well, you can imagine what he's talking about.
Shot in the dark. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me along. I suppose the question I'm going to be looking at is, can we have our cake and eat it? Can we have fluffy wildlife as well as all the food production we want as well? Now, having your cake and eat it kind of implies that we can only have one thing. You've got to make your mind up. You've got to be businesslike about this. Stop fluffing about. Cut through it. Make up your mind. What do you actually want? Can you have fluffy wildlife, or can you have the food that we know we really need? It's pointing us in a particular direction, isn't it? It's focused. It's business-like. Cut the crap. Cut the fluffy nonsense. You know what you need to do. That's where that sort of phrase comes from, isn't it? But if you look at it again, if you only produce food from land, or if you only have water resources from land, or if you only store carbon on land, or if you only have recreational use of land, or even if you only have wildlife conservation on land, then that's a very inefficient use of land. A recent report, just to step back a little bit, a recent report a few years ago, I think it was called Taking Stock, looked at our global footprint, the number of global hectares we all use. Add that all up, and what you actually find is that the area we need to support our population is 29 times the physical area of the southeast of Britain. So the southeast needs an area about the size of France to look after it. So that could mean the end of the world for us, couldn't it? But the way I look at that is that this simply underpins the actual need to look at multiple delivery on any area of land. You've got to do lots of things in one spot to overcome that problem. So multiple delivery is the thing. If we only think about maximising on one of those products, then that's very short-term, very transitory, maybe a short-term economic benefit, but wouldn't work in the long term. These dichotomies, can we have this, or can we have that, or can we have that, are completely false. In the past, it was assumed that public benefits we get from farmland were the inevitable byproduct of good farming. It's what William said earlier. This is why farming was left out of the planning laws, the planning controls, because generally speaking, if the farming was good, if it was in good heart, then you actually got a lot of these public benefits into the bargain. That's largely true, but it's not inevitable. It's not the inevitable consequence. If you focus too much on just one product of farming, then the other things you get degraded. And actually, I think, in the process, we degrade our own view of farmers and farming. This is a picture that came out of the National Ecosystem Assessment, where all the ecosystems in Britain were actually assessed for what they were delivering for us, and what the services we were getting from those ecosystems, the ecosystem services. They found we'd done extremely well on provisioning services, particularly food production. A story of success, but that was done at the expense of a lot of other ecosystem services, which are equally important. So you could say, or farmers could say, well, we're actually just trying to trying to farm badly in order to provide your fluffy wildlife. That's one way of looking at it. And some people are saying, well, why should we pay all these farmers large amounts of money just to look after some bugs and beetles that nobody's interested in anyway? That's not the way around I see it. The first thing you need to do for any of this is to get the ecosystem right. You've got to have functioning, healthy ecosystems out of which you get all those other services. You'll only get wildlife if you've got a healthy ecosystem. You'll only get soils, water percolation, flood protection, carbon storage if you've got healthy, effective ecosystems. So first of all, you need to get the ecosystems right. Looking at it the other way, it's actually quite silly to suggest that you only need to focus on one thing and get that right. You only need to focus on food production or water percolation or wildlife. It's a bit silly. Let's look at that. If you just focus on one thing, it would be very difficult to produce food whilst not actually thinking about the soils, nutrient cycling, water cycling. How can you grow food without soil, nutrients or water? So ecosystem services come in bunches, they come in bundles, they come in associated groups. They all work together. That's kind of an inevitability. So get the ecosystem right is the first thing. But how do you tell if you're getting the ecosystem right? Well, the wildlife gives you a clue, doesn't it? If you've got a rich biodiversity, a rich diversity of wildlife, a rich diversity of wildlife habitats, high quality wildlife habitats, then the odds are you've actually got quite a good ecosystem as well, and the odds are you're getting the ecosystem services as well. The link is weak, but it is there. But there is a problem, isn't there? Farmers really, as you saw earlier, farmers really only get paid for food, plus a few other incentives as well. And actually, I don't think they get paid very well for food. It's almost a market failure in itself. We have to support that market, but they only get paid for food. How or why should they spend all their money looking after all our ecosystem services? Why? How do we make that link? We can no longer take for granted all the benefits we get from nature, the ecosystem services, if we don't actually try and find a way of recompensing the people who are actually providing that for us. Otherwise, inevitably, we'll continue to degrade them, we'll continue to ignore them. We can't ignore the benefits we're getting from nature. The best way to see whether we're getting the benefits from nature is the quality of the wildlife that lives there. That's why the downs and the wildlife we get on the downs is so important. Get that right, and the ecosystem services we're getting from the downs are likely to be right as well. So, I think that's probably about my 5 minutes. So just going back to the question, can we have our cake and eat it? This implies a kind of impossible double counting, saying you can't have both, so you've got to choose. I'll turn it the other way round. I think it implies a false dichotomy. You actually must have both. So you must have everything. You can't just make up your mind on one thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Our next speaker is Robert Cheeseman, the chairman of the South Downs Society. And since I said Tony was going to speak on wildlife and he only got to it at the end, I'm not going to guess now what Tony's going to speak about. Over to you.
Yep, thank you very much. Well, I'm not going to speak about wildlife. I'm going to speak about access and recreation on the Downs. But before I get round to that, just a few words about the South Downs Society. We've been around a long time. We were first formed in 1923 as the Society for Sussex Downsmen because we were concerned all those years ago, 90 years ago, about developments that were likely to take place on the Downs, and in particular around Peacehaven. And it was the thought of further peace havens taking place further east at Crowlink that really got us going. But that's where the history part. We have, of course, since then played a significant role in the South Downs campaign, in campaigning to have a national park for the South Downs, because we felt that it was only by having such a statutory body that the Downs would be properly protected, both from a planning angle and indeed the social, economic and the enjoyment side too. So we're delighted that we've got that. We're now working with the National Park Authority, I'd like to feel, as its critical friend, watching what it's doing, suggesting things to it as well. So, what about access and recreation? Right from the early days, the Society found a need to provide a programme of walks and strolls for its members. Now, we've got about 2,000 members now, and I'll leave some membership leaflets out for those who may wish to join. But during the course of a year, we're running about 250 walks or strolls, because these provide people with an opportunity to get into the Downs. Some people, you see, lack confidence in going onto the Downs themselves. They need to be led. Now, not everybody needs that, but some do. And there is therefore a need, not just for bodies like mine, and indeed others, Ramblers Association and other walking groups, to provide that facility in order to see the Downs and experience them in all their majesty. I was brought up in Lewes in a house where at the end of the back garden we were straight onto the Downs. And so my experience of the Downs came from a very early age, exploring. That's one of the things I think young people need to do. Get out into the open, explore what there is around. I was also walking from a very early age, obviously close to home to begin with, but further afield as I got older. And what I find really amazing about the South Downs is how tranquil it can be if you go to the right places. People think, oh, we've got all these big towns around, from Eastbourne in the east right through to Portsmouth and so on in the west, and they're noisy places. Yes, they are. And parts of the Downs are noisy. Of course, if you go to the Devil's Dyke, it might be a little noisy. But what if you go to some of the more tranquil places? What if you go to Ballsdean, for example, or the Chattery Memorial, or to Ashcombe Bottom? You might hear the occasional plane, but you might also hear some wildlife. And that, I think, is important. When you go out into the Downs, you can experience this tranquility, but you can also experience the wildlife if you sit and listen for it. You can experience the flora and fauna. One has only got to look around to see what there is. And too many people, in my view, don't have that opportunity. They don't have this opportunity to appreciate the natural features. And I'd like to feel that there are ways to give them that opportunity. But I'd equally like to feel that now we have a National Park Authority, that it will play its part to enhance what there is, not to make it worse, to enhance what there is, conserve it and interpret it, to put pressure on the highway authorities who are responsible for the public rights of way to make sure they're really the best that we could have in the national park. I've mentioned encouraging others. One of the projects that we're involved in at the moment is called Mosaic. And Mosaic involves bringing people from the black and minority ethnic communities, partly from London but also other large cities, who have never experienced the countryside, to bring leaders of these groups into the Downs, show them what it is that we have, and then those leaders will go back and hopefully bring parties of their own young people into the Downs to experience this tranquility and the wildlife that I've talked about. I've talked about people not having confidence. How many people can really read a map? You know, how many of you young people at the back can pick this map up and take me for a walk? Good. One. One. Or was it two? And then we've got this access land business. You know, there's parts of the Downs, and indeed many other places, which are being designated access land, which means you can roam anywhere. But some of it's very difficult to get into. And so, in conjunction with the National Park Authority, we produce some maps. They're not available in hard copy, they're only available on the website to show how you get into some of this access land. This is one from Malling Hill, but there are others as well. So, I support this initiative. I hope that it's something which will enable more people to experience the wonderful downs and countryside that we have in this area. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Okay, our final speaker, before you get a chance to ask some questions, is Trevor Beattie, who is the Chief Executive of the South Downs National Park Authority. The title of what he is here is Overview. I think it's more food for thought for us to think about later on. So over to you, Trevor. You have a little bit longer because you're going to cover all the things they said and some more probably as well.
Only 5 minutes long.
A little bit longer.
Thank you very much, Martin, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll start by answering the question: what role should the South Downs play in our lives? My answer is a central one and an inspirational one. And it is my great good fortune to have a job that is about helping to make the South Downs National Park central and inspirational. I'll explain a bit what I mean by that. I'm very fortunate to be the Chief Executive of the newest national park, the UK's newest national park. We're just 1 year old. 1,650 square kilometres, huge, 100 miles east to west, from the edge of Eastbourne in the east to the edge of Winchester in the west. 108,000 people live in the national park. It includes all of Lewes, of Midhurst, of Petersfield, of Petworth, 85%, as William has already said, 85% of the national park is actively farmed, and that is one of its great assets. 1% of it is urban. And what makes this big, unique park so unique, so different from other national parks, is not actually its population, although actually 2.5 times as many people live in the South Downs as in any other national park. It's not its size, although only the Lake District and the Yorkshire Dales are larger. It's not the beauty and the diversity of its habitats, which we've already heard about from Tony, although actually, did you know chalk downland is the scarcest, much scarcer as a habitat than the rainforest, and is the richest habitat in northwest Europe, one of the most precious assets this nation has. Now, what makes the South Downs so uniquely different is that it's a living, economically vibrant park that is used by and shaped by its communities, and that shapes those communities in turn. That's what I love about the South Downs. That's why I think the issue here is a question of balance, and that's why I don't think we have to choose between the perspectives of the different speakers, because together they make up the South Downs. Let me explain what I mean. Illustrate it, maybe. We all have our favourite places on the Downs. One of mine is Blackcap Hill. I expect many of you know it. If you get up to Ditchling Beacon and head out west, eventually you come to Blackcap Hill. It's in the ownership of the National Trust, a ring of trees, a triangulation point, spectacular views. I remember one day being up there with watching separate thunderstorms, one out to sea on one side and one out from the Downs, the other side, out in the lowland. And I also remember not getting wet despite these clashing storms coming in on Blackcap Hill, although as soon as I headed for the car I got completely drenched actually, but a very special place. But the point about Blackcap Hill, it isn't an isolated ring of trees at the top of the Downs. It is actually the heart of a community. It's in the parish of East Chiltington, which is a lateral parish, and it runs from Blackcap at the top, down the Scarp, through a pub, church, with a bit of the Weald at the bottom. It includes the spring line. It is a traditional, long, thin parish running up the Downs, designed that way because the economy ran up and down the Downs. You had a bit of the spring line, you had a bit of the good farmland at the bottom, you had your church in the middle, the pub in the middle, and you grazed your sheep at the top. That determined the shape of the parish, and the parish determined the way the Downs actually worked. And that shaping of people of the Downs and of the Downs of people is going on today. And actually, if that ever stops, the Downs will cease to exist, because our chalk grassland exists because it is farmed, because it is grazed. That very precious habitat is man-made and man-maintained. And so that's what's unique, I think internationally unique about the South Downs. It is a living park, not just about wide open spaces, but about people in spaces. And that's a continuing process, and that's why the National Park is actually producing its two key documents, its management plan and its core strategy. You see, it's so boring, those titles. I can see you switching off already. But we need a management plan, we need a core strategy, but we're not starting with the documents, we're not starting with the writing, we're starting with engagement. We've had a year of community engagement, and we'll have another year before we put pen to paper. We're starting with a small grants programme. In our first year, we handed out £400,000 to 57 small community projects. People who are enterprising, using the Downs, accessing the Downs, building their lifestyles on it. And that's why, incidentally, I support the Biosphere project. Actually, I don't think the Biosphere is any different to that East Chiltington model I described to you. The Biosphere is a 21st century version. We now have a city on the coast and the Downs that it needs to access. The Biosphere puts them in one part, accessing the city from the Downs and the Downs from the city. And it's one of my key roles in the National Park to open up the South Downs to make sure it's used by as many people as possible who live all the way along the coast, including Brighton and Hove. And I see the Biosphere as a 21st century access point, a 21st century expression of that integration between the South Downs and its people, between the economy, farming, habitat, wildlife. So that's my answer. The South Downs' role in our lives, all of us here in Brighton and Hove, is to be central and to be inspirational. It's a fantastic asset. Like all assets, it needs to be used if it's going to appreciate and grow. So let's use it, and let's do so now. Thank you.
So, we have five people here who have given us some interesting things to think about. Do we have some questions for them? Or some reactions? Yes, please. I don't know, is it worth asking if people say who they are? It might be useful, just to, if you're willing to do that, just to say who you are, because I think part of this is also getting to know not just these people, but also other people around here who have interesting things to say or think. So, please.
I'm Joyce Smith. I'm a Brighton resident for many years and also a former councillor who was very keen on the whole issue of biodiversity in the land. And really, I think my question is, I can recall the meeting we had through the Brighton Council on biodiversity, and I think it was probably some 3 years ago. And there have been tremendous progress, which is wonderful. But listening to the speakers coming from their, if you like, their directions, I'm wondering, and my question is, what is happening to bring all that together? Is it through the national park? And what kind of powers does the national park to have that, make that happen? We know that water is precious, we know that farmers have to make a living, we know that we need wildlife, all of those things. What is happening to actually do what Tony has been saying, that we have them all? Because we're not having them all at the moment. We know with the issue of water, how many years has the question of water been a problem with runoff from farming? Years. 20 years to my knowledge, because I was councillor at that time. So, come on, when and how is this actually going to happen?
Tony, you look like you're ready to start answering that.
Just a quick response on that. There's several things have been happening recently that have changed from the past. And I think that the key thing that's happened in terms of shaping the discussion and what we talk about is actually about ecosystem services. 10 years ago, biodiversity, yes, it was very important. And even now, biodiversity, this is alongside all the ethical and spiritual and moral reasons for biodiversity conservation. But actually the whole subject of ecosystem services has gone right up the agenda, right in the centre of politics. There's now a lot of work on the actual value of nature to people. Before we knew it, but we couldn't actually prove it. Increasingly the evidence is there, increasingly it's very obvious that we need to have everything. We need to have that functioning ecosystem in order to have all of these benefits. And I believe that's actually fundamentally shifted the ground for our discussion to the benefit of wildlife, understanding the proper value of wildlife.
Can I say a word
Yeah,
about that?
please.
Just one of the national park, first of all, has a primary responsibility for what you're describing. And a series of powers. It's a statutory body. Now, of course, Brighton and Hove is not in the National Park, but the National Park includes the downlands to the north of Brighton and Hove, many miles east and west. And the Biosphere will link the two together, and I think that's one of my great, from my point of view, the great assets of the Biosphere. But we are the National Park Statutory Planning Authority, and we have an absolute statutory commitment to promote and conserve and enhance that environment, that biodiversity you describe. One way we're doing that is through a State of the Park report, which we'll be publishing very shortly, within 2 or 3 months, which will be an extensive look, a baseline survey at the quality of the habitats across the national park. They vary widely, they're under many types of challenge and threat. And that baseline survey we will make available widely, and we're going to use that to measure change. It will set a state where we are now, we're going to have a vision for 2032, a 30-year vision. And month on month, week on week, day on day, we will measure our progress against that baseline. We have the planning system and our statutory powers to promote that, but most important, we have the partnership with our local authorities, 15 local authorities across the park, fantastically supportive authorities, all of them, Brighton and Hove playing an amazing role in that, and they will provide the clout that we need to work with them to make that happen. But it's a long task, it's a 30-year task, but we've got to find out where we are before we know where we're going, and that work is nearly complete.
Okay, yes, please.
Got about a dozen questions, but I'll ask one. What your 30-year vision? What effect will it have globally on the Earth?
Wow, right, globally, I would certainly argue that the South Downs is a globally unique resource, as I've described. I like to compare the South Downs with the rainforest, because everyone knows about the rainforest, but actually chalk grassland is rarer than rainforest, and there are 47 species in 1 square metre of chalk grassland, and actually in the average square metre of rainforest there are fewer species. There's actually more totally, but I'm using the facts to my own advantage. Therefore, what I'm saying is the South Downs and chalk downland, and actually I don't just, because there's an east-west issue here, I also include the wooded heaths out to the west by Hampshire, are internationally unique. And I think we need to raise the profile of what we're about in the South Downs, and that's one of our roles. We've only been at it a year, but in my view the South Downs and the National Park has got it and needs to do more to flaunt it. But we can't just go out there promoting the South Downs on our own, so we need to do it with our partners. I think UNESCO and their role in the biosphere is really important in that. I see UNESCO and the people from UNESCO are here as our real champions with Brighton and Hove in getting that message out internationally. But I also think we need to get our homework right first. And therefore, before we can be really brash, we need to do major engagement with the communities that make up the South Downs. There's 179 parishes across the South Downs. And we, across the past year, have had meetings with almost every one of them. But that exercise needs to be continuous and rich and growing. So we need to do our homework first. But I really agree with you. We've got it. We should flaunt it.
Thank you. This lady here.
My name's Vivian Eliadis, and I'm one of the volunteer lookers that look after the sheep in our urban grasslands. And I noticed in the farming talk that you mentioned producing fuel. I'd like to know what kind of fuel you produce and whether it's sustainable, and how you work with all the other organisations to make sure that it doesn't affect adversely the South Downs.
Right, I can't tell you off the top of my head what percentage of the rape that's grown on the Downs might be going toward biofuel, but there are targets that have been set at the European level, so there will be some contribution being made by some of the oilseed rape that you see on the Downs, but not possible to say what exactly. So that's one fuel source. I suppose on farms there's an awful lot of current time, I would say, untouched woodland, unmanaged woodland that could benefit from a wood fuel market taking off. And obviously fuels in other forms. I suppose the sun is a form of fuel, is it not? I mean, as an energy source. So I'm talking about diversified fuel as well. So does that answer? I forgot what the second part of your question was. Is it sustainable?
I mean, whether it's sustainable and whether it works with the whole idea of biodiversity, and whether any reduction of any of the fuel on the South Downs can affect the land that we have.
I'm no expert, but I think there was the Gallagher review which looked at whether we should be concentrating resource on growing food or fuel and food, if you like. All I can say is that is it sustainable bringing biofuel from Brazil and other places to here, or groundnut kernels to burn in our power stations, where we can actually grow something here. And last time I looked, I didn't think we were particularly short of food in this country. So it's a very amateurish way of saying I don't believe it's particularly unsustainable to be growing both food and fuel in this country.
Trevor and Tony.
The South Downs has always been used to produce fuel, actually. I just think we need to do it intelligently and with an eye to the habitats and the landscape. Give you an example, coppicing was a traditional method of producing fuel, and one of the things the authority is trying to do is bring back coppicing. We have one of the rarest butterflies. The second rarest butterfly on the Downs is the pearl-bordered fritillary. It got down to about 20 butterflies. We've grown the number of butterflies, that population of butterflies, by coppicing the area that it lives in, which produces sunlight down onto the, produces violets, actually a type of violet it uses, it eats. And so by producing fuel intelligently in the right place through coppicing, we've actually trebled the number of pearl-bordered fritillaries. So it can be done. You've got to link back to the way it was done. You've got to do it sensitively with an eye to the ecosystem as a whole.
Well, actually, Trevor's been reading my notes, I think, because I was going to give a similar sort of example. I agree with you, Tony, which is great. And I'll go further, actually, even than some of the speakers, because I think this is a classic case of win-win. If we actually manage forests in particular in the right sort of way, we don't just not damage wildlife, we actually positively boost it. We have a huge history of woodland management done in a particular way as a fuel source. The Weald of Sussex was an industrial source of fuel. If we get it right, we can actually, well, as I've been saying all the time, we not merely can have both, we must have both. And I think when it comes to woodland management, for field, done in the right way, classic win-win.
Okay, thank you.
Can I add to that as well? Just in terms of groundwater, actually woodland is great because it tends to sort of stop, you don't use extra chemicals and things in woodland areas. It stops, the trees will suck up any chemicals that are there already. So actually it can be a win-win from the groundwater point of view as well. So in particularly vulnerable areas, it is one thing that we're beginning to think, is it possible in the very vulnerable areas? So let's encourage that, and that's some of the things that we're talking about together.
Okay,
This all
thanks.
sounds all very cosy, but in this area in the southeast, now earmarked 185 oil.
Yes.
That is bigger than a piece of wood.
Yes, we have threats as well.
You don't talk about it.
Yeah, there are. I know that I was at a site on Sunday where there was an oil site next to it. Certainly, from the environmental point of view, we regulate the oil sites, and actually, what you physically see when you go out is actually relatively small in terms of impact. I was really surprised by how little the visual impact was at the time.
But this is 185 new ones that haven't started to be drilled.
I guess, is that 185, that's your investigation as opposed to definitely production? Because there's a difference in terms of
production, but what is going to happen
That's
in the
what-
next 30 years? What does the South Downs Park actually mean in law and with people, every kind of people, every kind of industry, farming, etc.?
Quite right. That's why we needed a South Downs National Park in the first place. That's why it was created a year ago under statute. It is the planning authority for the whole of the national park. It's the 8th largest planning authority in the country, and any major application of that kind would have to be tested against the things I've talked about. We are the planning authority. Ultimately, the national park has statutory planning powers, but more powerful than that, we have relationships with all of our stakeholders, particularly with the local authorities that make up the park. It's a shared agenda, and that's how major challenges of any kind, whatever they are going to be tackled and overcome over the next 30 years.
Okay, up at the back there.
On fracking, for example, Balkan, British Council decided that they would go ahead with this. What was your input on that?
Well, it wasn't in the park. I mean, I have to...
Not in the park, sorry.
No, I mean, I'm only talking about the area of the national park. Okay. Outside the area of the national park, it will be in the area of an individual local authority, and that's why I stressed to this lady earlier, we work in partnership with the local authorities. Although there's 15 authorities in the park, actually many of them, like Brighton and Hove, it's only a small part. Eastbourne, it's a small part, and that's why initiatives like the Biosphere that link wider areas together, part of the park with the authorities, are so important.
Yes.
We can develop combined approaches to threats like that.
But who has to find the same?
The planning authority, whoever it is, and in the case of issues like fracking, the Environment Agency in Natural England, it depends. There are a series of the local authority, the planning authority, and if it needs a licence, the Environment Agency.
We've certainly got a group of people looking at the Environment Agency's response to fracking, and there's a couple of people in my team looking at the Balkan example, as far as I know, working with national experts to look at whether there's an impact. So if we would consider that there was a potential impact on groundwater within my team, we would put in an objection to the planning authority and then choose whether or not to take that on board.
Is the science developed enough to determine whether there's an impact on the ground?
It's a good question. It's not something I've looked into myself a lot. I know the Environment Agency's view is that actually it is okay as a technology. It's
really?
Yeah, I know. It's got with the right controls. There is a way of doing it that is because it's opening up fractures to get the oil out. What we need to stop happening is anything from the process getting out into the environment in a place it shouldn't be. So it's just maximising the way that the oil comes out, rather than actually, we certainly would not say yes if we considered it was going to get out to the environment. But that's the research that has come through recently, I believe. It says actually, as a technology in general, yes, it's a reasonable technology, but it needs the right controls.
Well, it's been banned in Germany and France.
I think this sounds like a hot topic for continuation later or in the future. The lady there, did you... No, you finished.
Well, I just want to go back to what Trevor had said about the National Park, and that as a member of the National Park Authority, but also the City Council, there is obviously the rigid statutory boundary of the park, but we've deliberately identified that because there's 10 times as many people just living on the edge of the boundary as there is within, the very special test that the National Park is not somewhere over there back and beyond, away from people. Proximity is incredibly important. So there is a recognition within the special qualities of the National Park that was specifically mentioned Brighton Hove as an example now of a community of interest. So we're not just talking about the communities living physically within the park. And that recognises the environmental services that the park is providing, but also coming the other way, recreational importance and access issues, which you say about people being able to better percolate into the grounds and remaining relevant to their lives. So I think that is the massive challenge for the park, is to actually go outside its statutory boundaries and keep to that. And that then it would really be working for us. And I think the Biosphere gives us an opportunity locally here to kind of realise that a bit more, because the Biosphere is able to step outside of that. Because in Brighton and Hove, I should also just add, 40% of the city is actually in the National Park anyway. It's only the urban bit that is kept outside, 40% of it. And we as a city, quite uniquely really, are a massive public landowner as well. So we've got a lot of say in that land area within the park, which is a very exciting possibility for us.
Yeah, please.
Hi, I was just wondering, I'm very conscious of the fact that a lot of people in the city only have access to the national park in the Downs via a motor car. So I wondered what's in place, or what thoughts have you got for ensuring that there is sustainable transport for anybody to access the Downs?
Well, key issue. Pete's just mentioned the importance of linking Brighton to the Downs and opening up access. And we're looking as part of the local transport bid in terms of bus routes across the park to look at how we open it up, how we make public transport more accessible to the park. On the western side of the park, we've launched a pilot project, which I'd like to extend here as well, of electric bicycles. And this is the Queen Elizabeth Country Park. From my point of view, it's in the park, but from your point of view, it's way out in Hampshire. And what we're doing there is launching a scheme of electric bicycles. And they're great because they're just what you need in a hilly national park, because they help you up the hills and then you can cycle yourself down them. It's fantastic. And I'd like to extend that network, because the other thing I'd like to do, so much to say on this, but another thing to say is my perception in Brighton, you may tell me I'm wrong, is that Brighton accesses the Downs, people from Brighton access the Downs in one or two few hotspots. Ditchling Beacon, the Devil's Dyke, and in fact many of the visitors to Devil's Dyke never actually see the dyke, they just go to the pub and look out from the car park. There's actually a dyke behind there.
Very true.
And Beachy Head. And one of my real hobby horses is I want to extend the use of the park, which will relieve the pressure, open it up to people. And by the way, a lot of people in Brighton live in places they can go out to their... Robert talked about going out of his back door. A lot of people in Brighton can go out of their back door and straight up onto the Downs. But I want to open that up much more. And Pete and I are working with Brighton and Hove, in addition to the Biosphere, which is an important initiative. Pete and I are working on a protocol so we can get our national park access priorities well aligned with Brighton and Hove's access priorities. It's a huge job, lots of ways of tackling.
Yeah, more footpaths over that dreadful A27.
I just think getting the train company on board as well to be like really practical and sensible about allowing cycles on those goddamn things, you know, and it'd just be great if some of you really got behind that, because they're just little practical tweaks that would make the world of difference.
And also more wheelchair access if you can. I mean, I know it's impossible in some parts, but as much as possible, because I know there's a lot of people that would like to access places, but they can't.
Right, Tony, you had one?
Just very briefly, taking it the other way around as well as getting from the town into the countryside, it's actually bringing the countryside into the town, actually making sure you've got those green fingers coming into Brighton, which actually Brighton is very good at. There are many really good examples of wildlife habitat striping right down into Brighton. We can make better use of those as well. So as well as getting out there, it's making sure you've actually got that wildlife on your doorstep, so you don't have to travel for miles.
Right.
Just back onto bus routes in the Downs. I'm not sure most people realise that rural bus services need heavy subsidy. They don't make profit. They're hugely subsidised. And they're always under threat of cut from council or from wherever. And wondering whether the National Park would consider funding. And particularly considering the Biosphere Reserve, the green buses, which is fairly key to getting people out on a sustainable basis out to the surrounding towns.
Well, I'm not going to deal with individual project proposals here and submissions here, because we have our own process for approving projects. But access to the Downs and bus routes are very important. I suspect some of it is looking at those bus routes and considering where they go, how they're structured, and working with the local authority. Subsidising bus routes is a tough one for a National Park Authority with a limited budget and 15 local authorities, but it's certainly something we're looking at. And indeed, we've been talking with Brighton Hove about it to see if we can come up with some kind of proposal. But it's not something I'd want to do on a blanket basis, because we could use our whole budget subsidising bus routes. We have to be very careful on this. There's a huge agenda out there which we've been actually really helpfully setting out here, and access and bus routes is just one part of it.
Lady over there.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Vic. I'm from Brighton Hove Food Partnership. My question is going to go back to some of the things we were touching on earlier, which we've all spoken about how much food gets produced in the South Downs, but very little of it actually comes in to the city or to the other areas here. To what extent does this work actually support local infrastructure for food production? And I'm talking billing, abattoirs, transport systems, or does the planning regulations in the South Downs mean that's not going to happen?
Well, I mean, I'm not seeing anything involved in the Biosphere. I mean, 10 days ago I thought the Biosphere was the Eden project, so they're on quite a very steep learning curve. But I know obviously a bit about how our supply chains are structured, and they really aren't structured terribly well to bring local produce into the city for a start. They are mainly based around multiple retailers, and that's just a fact of life. The National Park does have a branding initiative, and some attempts have been made to brand local land, for instance, and other products, but they tend to be the premium end of the market. I don't know how well that would fit in the city here, possibly not where you'd want that local food to go. So I don't have any answers on that. And you mentioned abattoirs. I mean, there is actually, if you look at it nationally, over-provision of abattoirs, strangely, in the country. But we do have this strange scenario whereby cattle will go from this part of the world to be killed up in Yorkshire, but that is to go to a Waitrose supermarket. And there are smaller abattoirs, so I would say we have provision, but it's a question of opening up the markets here, and then you'll see supply chains develop. But that's a piece of money.
Okay, I think one more question.
I wanted to take up the question of local food. It seems to me that there's a lot of complementary interests between the wildlife, the improvement and maintenance of good soil, feeding of people healthy food, decreasing the amount of cost on transport. The missing link is the farmer earning sufficient income. So the farmers tend to go with the income, and as the gentleman said, it's a fact of life. Does the Biosphere have any capacity to change the rules a bit in terms of where the subsidies go? Because if we subsidised, when I say good farming, I mean farming that is good for the soil, the people, and the wildlife. So we could turn it on its head a little bit and therefore give the farmers a greater incentive to do what we would like them to do in terms of feeding the locality.
Did you?
Just briefly, I think those two questions are really key. And this is where you can't answer it in a sentence, but I think this is where the work of the Biosphere Reserve will spend some of its time focusing. I can see some good potential. I haven't got any answers, but I can see some good potential. The whole subject of payment for ecosystem services is growing very fast, not just here but in Europe as well. The idea that we can actually identify what we're getting from the appropriate treatment of land and actually repay the farmer for doing that. That, I think, is a very live subject and something that I've got a lot of hope for. And also there are some existing structures and mechanisms which can be probably tweaked to enable that. But I think, implication in what you're saying is there's a lot of gaps there at the moment. We're not actually getting it there. But there's a lot of will, I think, within the National Park, within the Biosphere Reserve, within a lot of other discussions, trying to make those links so we do actually get payment to the right people who are providing those services from the people who are getting them.
I mean, William will have more to say about this, but I just wanted to say that the Downs exist because of the people who farm it. 85% of it's actively farmed. And I think William mentioned the importance of kite marking the products of the Downs and branding them, and that's something I'm very keen to do. And that is more than just a cosmetic thing. That is actually partly about ensuring that the people who farm the Downs get the right reward for that work. Here in Brighton and Hove, the water we drink depends on the chalk downlands. 1.2 million people are supplied with water, as Lucy said. And actually, I'm not convinced people understand that. I'm not convinced people understand just how many of the products that are consumed, the high quality food that Martin referred to earlier, is actually a product of the Downs around us. And I think if we can brand it properly, people will respect the Downs more, but they'll also give the farmers the right remuneration for it. And that's the way you get the investment back into the Downs, and you get a virtuous circle. And the Biosphere is about nothing if it's not about that virtuous circle.
Okay, I think I need to wrap it up. One thing I think, though, is worth saying that this is not going to be, assuming it's approved by UNESCO, the only biosphere on the planet. There are quite a lot of other ones, and they have all had people asking similar sorts of questions and trying to find ways to address them. And so that's one of the advantages of being in this UNESCO network, is that there are other people out there in France or Sweden or Germany or wherever that you could actually get some other ideas from. They may not have all the answers, but they might have something that could help you. So that is one point to make. Don't just think about this place on its own. Think of it as part of a network of places trying to do the same thing. All of those places with people with passions, as I can hear some very strong passions here. You have to use your passions to get in the right direction, but I think you also have to work together and find out where the shared values are, the shared interests are, and recognize that this is a special place. I think part of the other thing with sharing and using things together is that budgets are limited, and you have to try and do what you can, or as much as you can, with what you have, and that's not going to get any easier. And thinking of new ideas, some of which have come up here, again, may be available in other places, is something that also may come along as this comes to fruition. It's important to say the Biosphere itself will not bring any specific money in as itself, but what we've seen in other places in the UK is that it can help leverage in funding, because a lot of funding agencies nowadays like to see that partnerships are asking for the money, not just one agency or another, but a partnership. And once you have the partnership, thinking about the different angles, then your chances of actually leveraging in the support to make things happen can be much more successful. So I guess to finish, I've been here for about 24 hours, slightly more, but I think this is a very special place, and I think most of you are here in the room because you do think it's a special place. I think here is a great slogan, and I think we can listen to that. Hearing and listening go together, and I think that's something to do for the next year or so until the approval process gets going, and then hopefully in a little bit longer than that, this will be a biosphere designated by UNESCO. And thank you for coming.